So welcome, my name is Terrence Barkin, the Executive Director of the Graphene Council, and we're hosting today's session, which will be presented by two experts from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Alex Stanton and Jim Allwood. And I'm going to ask Alex and Jim if they can join us, introduce themselves, and then they're going to bring up their presentation and we're going to hear from them. And then afterwards, we're going to have a Q&A session. I'm also joined, by the way, online by John Baker, who's a member of the Graphene Council team. He's an industrial hygienist and an expert in this area, and he'll be helping me moderate today. So with that, Alex and Jim, if you want to introduce yourselves, and Alex, when you're ready, pull up your slides, and then it's all yours.
Sure. So thank you so much. I'm Alex Stanton, and I'm a team leader in the industrial chemistry branch for the New Chemicals division at EPA.
And hi, I'm Jim Allwood. I'm the branch chief in our risk management branch in the New Chemicals division at EPA.
Thank you guys so much for letting us come talk to you about graphene and what you could expect trying to get your graphene into the US market. And I do want to give a little backstory of how we got to thinking that this would be a good idea. So last fall, I was lucky enough to join several of you in Pittsburgh for a Graphene Council meeting. And as I was seated, my name tag was not visible, which allowed me to be part of a rousing discussion of how difficult it is to work with EPA, how annoying it is to get chemicals through the review process. What does EPA even want? It's demoralizing, it's long, it's impossible. It crushes the will to live. And I will always treasure the horrified looks when I finally stood up and introduced myself as the EPA representative. But on a high level, I don't want you to lose the will to live as you submit your graphene for review. You don't want that. So let's kind of set expectations of what this process looks like so that we can go into it with clear vision. So 40 years ago, back in the day, there was the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is what we call TSCA. So every time you hear TSCA, it's this law. This is a kind of catch-all general law for industrial chemicals. If you don't fall into a specialty category of chemical, you are not a pesticide, fungicide, rodenticide, cosmetic, drug, food, nuclear, ammunition, tobacco, alcohol. You're just a run-of-the-mill chemical doing your best in a hard world. You might be subject to TSCA. And in 2016, there was an update to TSCA, which we call Lautenberg. So the Frank R. Lautenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. And the big change between the TSCA of 1976 and this updated TSCA is that now EPA makes affirmative findings on all new chemicals or significant new uses of existing chemicals before those chemicals can enter the market. So this was a big change from what we used to do before, where if we had a little more leeway to not do full, intense, gritty reviews on every single chemical that came our way, and now we do. And so this has affected how we think about chemicals, the depth to which we go, and also the timing of which chemicals can enter the market. Okay, so we're talking about Section 5 specifically of TSCA, which if you are bored and you cannot sleep one night, this will just put you right to sleep. You can go look it up, Section 5. And this is the section of TSCA for anyone who plans to manufacture, which includes import, and I'll emphasize that more as time goes on, a new chemical substance, or have a significant new use for an existing chemical substance before you actually initiate the activity. So before you actually do it, under Section 5, you're going to submit your chemical for review to us. This will probably be in the form of a pre-manufacture notice or a significant new use notice. And we're going to look at that chemical and the conditions of use that you have provided to us and that we look at ourselves. And we're going to make one of 5 potential affirmative findings for you to take with you into the world. Conditions of use is a very specific term. You might say, why was that in quotation marks? So this is not just what you intend to do to your chemical. So you have your chemical, you're excited about it, you want to hit the US market, you want it to be used, and you say, I'm going to take my graphene and I'm going to put it in a polymer And then those polymers are going to go and be in yoga mats, and the yogis are going to love me, and I'm going to get all the awards from all of the yogis. And that's wonderful, and we love that. However, we also have to think about uses that we either know about or that are reasonably foreseen for your chemical. So you are not the only graphene manufacturer in the world. Graphene has existed before, it exists to this day. People use it for many things. And so it's not just what you say you're going to do with it, but what EPA could reasonably foreseen could be done with your chemical as well. So we're going to take all of that information into account when we actually review your chemical. Okay, so you're going to submit your chemical. Everything is going well, yay, but maybe not, because before you do that, you have some questions. You've gotten onto the website to decide if you're going to submit a pre-manufacture notice or a significant new use notice, or what's the difference between those. And it got overwhelming. And so before you actually submit for review, you can contact the EPA in advance with a pre-notice communication. And in fact, there is a link on the website itself. You can click it, it'll show up. You can send us an email and say, I am making graphene and I have questions, and we will contact you and talk to you either by phone or email. We can even hold a whole conference with you if we need to get some of your scientists and our scientists to talk. But this is a great way to get some questions answered before you actually go through the full submission. So you can tell us a little bit about your graphene, and you can say, hey, I want to use graphene to fight COVID. Should I submit this to you? And we can say, wonderful plan. No, you should submit under a different law that's not in our jurisdiction. Or you could say, here's my graphene. Should I submit for a pre-manufacture notice, or do I qualify for an exemption? And we can talk about what the exemptions that might apply to you look like. If you say, I have 10 graphenes and they're all kind of similar, do I need 10 notices, or can that be one notice with 10 chemicals in it? We can talk about that in advance too. Questions you have about what information you need to submit for manufacturing, processing, use, all of that. We're going to talk about this later, but one of the fun quirks of graphene is that there is no standard nomenclature yet. You guys are working on it. I am proud of you. Please do your best. Win over IUPAC. I would love that. But, in a new chemical review, presumably you would have a name of a chemical. But how do you name it if there's no standard naming? So you talk to us in advance about that too, and what you should be telling us about your chemical. Thank you. Now, in general, not just you graphene manufacturers, but everybody who submits a new chemical notice has to tell us these pieces of information. So they have to tell us what the chemical is. Obviously, we can't regulate a chemical that we don't know what it is. What the byproducts or impurities would be. You have to tell us how much you're intending to manufacture or import. What are your proposed uses? And what are the amounts that you're designating for each use? Is 90% of it going to one thing and 10% of it being divided up against 10 other uses? How does that work? What is the exposure to humans? Are workers being exposed to it? Are consumers being exposed to it? What's the general population's exposure? You're gonna have to tell us how you're disposing of your graphene material. Are you shipping barrels? Are you cleaning the barrels? Do you have dust? Is the dust being vented? Are you incinerating things? Are you releasing things to water? What's happening? And then any test data that you have on your chemical, you would also have to give us, or that is reasonable for you to ascertain. You'd have to give us as well. So again, I just want to emphasize, we're not going to, before you come in, we don't make you do extra testing in order to submit a new chemical review. But if you have studies in your possession, you are required to give them to us, and we want them. It can't be like, oh, I have studies on, I did some Daphnia studies, but there's no water releases, so I don't need to tell EPA about that. You do. You need to give us everything that you have. So once we have all of that information from you, we're going to do a evaluation on the full life cycle of your chemical. We're going to look at the manufacturing, processing, distribution, commerce, the use, the disposal of it, and we're going to look at all of those pieces and generate a full risk assessment for your chemical. Now, we know, and you know, that the whole point of this experience is that these are new chemicals. So you don't know everything. You are doing your best to generate useful information, and we are doing our best to review that useful information and make a risk assessment. So it won't be perfect. A lot of times we don't have a lot of data to work with. Things could be incomplete, things could be limited, things could just be approximations, but we're going to do our best to get a high quality risk assessment for every chemical that comes to us. So this is the risk assessment overview. From the very beginning, we're going to be looking at the chemistry. What did you tell us you had? What information did you give us about that chemical? Any PChem data? We're going to try to understand the fate of the chemical in the environment. Does it degrade? Does it accumulate? Does it do weird chemistry out there? What were your environmental releases like? That's part of also understanding exposure. Were humans exposed to this? Is the general population exposed to this? Is there a susceptible population that's exposed to this? Do environmental organisms, eat it, drink it? Does it get stuck in gills of fish? And from there, we're going to try to understand the hazard. So the potential hazard to human health and to the environment. And this combination gives us the risk assessment. So we determine risk both to human health and to the environment based on these pieces that we're looking at. Now you might say, wow, that's a lot. I don't know that I need all that now. I'm just trying to make a little graphene here on the side. And that's maybe fine. Not everything does need to go through this real intense review. We have some exemptions. So one, which you don't even need to tell us about, you can just do, is research and development. So there's a well-written document, easily found, that'll outline for you what is and is not considered research and development. But on the high level, if a grad student is doing it, that's probably research and development. We don't need to know if you're, trying to synthesize new versions of something, if you're performance testing new versions of something, if you've given it to your processor to see if they can even scale it up in their facility. That's between you and God. That's not our problem. That's fine. But there's a few types of exemptions that we do need to know about. So we have low volume exemptions for when you're only making a little bit of something. We have a low release or low exposure exemption for when you're making a lot of something, but it's not really going anywhere. So that would be like maybe a site limited intermediate. It's staying on campus. It's just being turned immediately into something else. Or maybe like a test market exemption where, you are going to make it, you are going to sell it, but only to a select group of customers so that we can see if anyone would even buy this. So no, go back, sorry. The important part about this is that these have shorter review periods, and they do cost a little less money. I don't know that that's here or there. I don't know that it's just a worthy amount of money to talk about, but they technically have shorter review periods and cost a little less money. So for pre-manufacture notices, for PMNs and SNUNs, we try to complete the review within 90 days, which, since we talked about this earlier with our new law, our amendment, we're looking at lots of chemicals now. So 90 days is optimistic, and you should anticipate that that time period will be extended. But for low volume exemptions and low rexes and such, we're trying to compress it even further into 30 days is what we're aiming for. So that's worth saying. All right, so the other critical thing to think about is that for these exemption applications that you're giving to us, we're gonna look at the chemical still. We're still gonna look at all the pieces, the manufacturing, processing, distribution, use, disposal, all that's still being looked at. And we're gonna do an assessment of whether or not these present an unreasonable risk to human health and the environment. And if there is a risk, we're going to say, no, you can't have that exemption and come back in as a pre-manufacturer notice. So, still have to pay more money and have more time. But if we grant it, if we say, okay, you're right, you're not, you don't want to make that much graphene, you just want to make a little bit and sell it to a little bit of a friend, and that's fine, and they're just going to use it for this one use, that's great. But whatever you have said in your submission, you are bound to. So you cannot then later say, oh, actually, my other processor friend wants to do this other thing to it, and then we can have a totally different use. That's not allowed. You have to hold to exactly what you said you were going to do. So it's very limiting, and it doesn't allow for growth later. And that's on purpose, because it's an exemption. It's supposed to be a faster, cheaper way to get, a little bit of something instead of getting the whole thing. All right, so you've decided that an exemption might not be a great fit for you, which is a reasonable thing to think. If you're a nanomaterial, you want options. So you have submitted a pre-manufacturer notice or a significant new use notice. You have 5 potential outcomes, as we discussed. So you can have risk, you can not have risk. That's not going to happen to you. We could just not know anything. We could know little and suspect risk, or you could just be making like a lot of it at all times. Presents unreasonable risk is the first finding we'll talk about. And that's when whatever you have said you were going to do is just like a bad idea. You did a bad thing. You're going to make risk. So either we're going to say you cannot do that thing because it is bad for human health and the environment. You must not do that. Or we're going to say you can do it with these restrictions. And this is not a negotiation. This isn't having a good time. This is what's happening because we have to protect human health and the environment. And you'll acknowledge that and you can move on with your restrictions. But this isn't like a yay, everyone's having fun thing. You're making something a little risky. You can have, I'm not totally confident, but this may present an unreasonable risk, and this is what will happen to you. So we're saying we don't have all of the information that we need to totally 100% say one way or the other. But based on the information that we do have, this seems like it may be a little risky. And so under that finding, we're going to say we're going to regulate you. So typically this looks like a Section 5E order, which is called a consent order, which means you can go ahead and commercialize it. You can make your chemical, but there's going to be restrictions. Sometimes there's also testing, depending on what we think the risk is. But a lot of times it's, hey, you can make your chemical. You can use it maybe only in these ways, or only with this, PPE, or only with this disposal method. And, maybe in 5 years, you'll also have to give us, some eco testing or something like that. And we'll give you that consent order, and you'll sign it, and we'll sign it, and we'll say, okay, that's a fair agreement. That's what we've all agreed to. And you'll go forth and you'll make your graphene. The next determination we're going to talk about is what we call the exposure-based finding, which is you've made so much of it. You just really committed to making graphene. You just overabundantly made it. This will also not happen to you, but you've just committed. You're just all the graphene ever. In which case you can still make it. We will still regulate you, but you can still make it. But typically we have testing after you make a certain amount, because you're just going to keep making it. There's just going to be so much we need to know about it. So that's also a consent order, but a little different approach to the testing. Insufficient information, we don't know. You've just given us a mystery. That's just, who knows? It could be fine, could not be fine. It's unknown, it's insufficient. So then we're going to make you do testing, because we don't know anything. We've never even heard of her. She's no friend of ours. So you'll go and you'll do testing. This is still, we're going to regulate you with a consent order, and the terms of the order are to do the testing. And so before you commercialize, you'll do the testing, you'll give us the testing, we'll look at the results, we'll then kind of go through the process again and make a finding. And then this will not happen to you. But it could be that we look at your graphene material and think, wow, this is great. This is not likely to present an unreasonable risk at all. Everything is perfect. And this happens with, certain chemicals that we know a lot about, or however they're being used is not challenging to human health or the environment. So we're saying, okay, you did it, go commercialize, have fun. One thing to note with that is that sometimes we make this finding because we propose a rule kind of in advance of the finding that basically says that, like, hey, for anyone making this chemical, you can't do the thing that we would have considered risky. So anyone who makes this chemical cannot release it to water, for example. or anyone who makes this chemical has to wear gloves. And we propose that rule, and then we say, hey, since we've already said anyone who's using this chemical has to use gloves, you will not present an unreasonable risk because you already know that you have to do the same. So that's kind of, those two go hand in hand for the not likely to present unreasonable risk finding. Okay, so why am I so darn convinced that you're going to get a very specific outcome for your review process? Well, nanomaterials, as we all know this, nanomaterials, they're unique. That's why we're here making them, having a good time with them. They have a weird size scale. That means they don't act like small molecules. They don't act like their bulk friends. They have a unique, they have unique properties. They can do unique things. We're very proud of them. So these very distinctive characteristics and these novel uses basically mean that there's a very different set of fate, transport, exposure, human and ecological health impact scenarios that we have to consider when we think about nanomaterials. And that's kind of why we know for the most part that while we're not confident that they are going to pose a risk, we're also not confident that they're not. This is where you get into the, may present unreasonable risk. There's different ecological concerns. We know that they're small, they have interesting surface chemistry, they have different particle sizes, they degrade in other ways that their bulk counterparts may not in the environment. Sometimes they aggregate, sometimes they dissolve, sometimes they react, sometimes the high surface area means that they have new phototoxicity abilities and they kill other fish. It's not great, and we don't know that for sure. Same thing for human health. These nanomaterials are tiny. Again, the whole point, small, nano, right? So they tend to have different solubility profiles than their bulk counterparts. They have very large surface areas. They can move through your body in ways you didn't even know. Blood-brain barrier, just cross it. It's fine. They love your lungs. They'll sit in there for years. They have excellent circulation time. They can still aggregate and just take up space in your kidneys, your liver, whatever they feel like it. And then sometimes they have their own properties from coatings or other surface chemistry they're doing, add to cell injury. So again, we don't know. So basically, because they can potentially, but not guaranteed, do some or all or any of these things. And it's very hard to characterize nanomaterials. One, just like as a normal chemical, if you're just in a lab, you have to do all sorts of unique characterization of your nanomaterial compared to what you'd have to do for either a bulk material or a small molecule analysis. You also have to do multiple things in tandem, typically, in order to get a profile of the chemical that you're looking at. And then if you are adding to I want to then study these things in the environment, we are still coming up with standards and test guidelines as to what information you'd actually have to collect for it to be meaningful. And all of this combined means we have insufficient information to make a super affirmative finding on your chemical. It may present unreasonable risk. That's the common outcome. Now, since 2005, we have reviewed over 250 new chemicals that are nanoscale. Lots of carbon nanotubes, lots of quantum dots, all sorts of exciting stuff. And most of them have indeed had the same finding. And this may present unreasonable risk finding, results in a consent order. And normally we're doing things, we're regulating them to limit the use or require certain PPE that must be used when you're using or making these chemicals, or we're telling you how you have to dispose of the nanomaterial or what your environmental release profiles can look like. Sometimes we ask for testing if we think it's going to be useful or important or insightful for the chemical that you have. And for graphene itself, so we just went over this earlier, you already know this, chemical nomenclature for graphene is not yet standardized. So when you're talking to us in your pre-notice communication, we're going to be asking you questions about the pChem properties of your graphene. We're going to want to know The number of layers, the starting materials, the catalyst that you've used, the reaction conditions, if there's functionalization, what the impurities are, what your platelet shape is like, all of this, because this is how we think about your chemical identity. We're also going to want to know lots of details about how people or the environment is exposed to your graphene during manufacturing or processing. How is it handled? Is it aerosolized or sprayed? Is it in a liquid formulation? Is it a dust? How does the end user actually interact with the chemical? Same with the uses. Graphene can be used for pretty much anything you want it to be used for if you're bold enough. So what are you actually going to do with it, and how are you actually going to do it? Will consumers be using it? Will it be sprayed? Is this going to be enshrined in an article? Is it going to be submerged in water? This is all going to be things that you're going to want to think about, and we'll discuss in the pre-notice consult. But this is information that needs to go into your submission so that we have a clear picture of what you're doing and you have a clear picture of what you're doing. So I will now pass it off to Jim for a little side quest on nanomaterial reporting.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And again, I'd also like to thank everybody for the chance just to reach out and give you more information about TSCA and graphene. I'm not going to spend too long on the Nano 8A rule, but we do have a reporting rule requirement. We issued this regulation in 2017, requires reporting for nanomaterials that meet the criteria in the rule. And the reason that people that make graphene probably don't need to be concerned, you're going to need a new chemical notice for your graphene material. And as soon as you submit a new chemical notice, you're exempt from reporting under this rule. So, and again, it asks for a lot of the same information that you would submit in a new chemical notice, but that way, for people who are aware of this rule and say, what's the difference? The difference is this probably applies more to somebody who's making a metal or another chemical that they can make with different particle sizes. And if it meets the criteria of the rule for size and for use, then they would have to, they would have to do reporting. Again, graphene producers probably aren't going to be affected by this rule at all. If we can just go to the next slide and go with that. Yeah. And all we're trying to do is get a better idea of how nanomaterials are being used commercially. So if we already have a new chemical notice, we don't need additional reporting for the 8A rule. So that's all I wanted to talk about with the 8A rule, just so, and again, if people have other follow-up questions, we can talk about that. And I just wanted to add a couple things, probably just reinforcing, all the details that, Alex just gave about new chemical review. Between the uncertainty with conditions of use and just nanomaterials and graphene in general, that's why you're going to get regulated if you submit a PMN for these chemicals, and it's probably a lot less likely that you'll be able to get an exemption for them. They'll have trouble meeting the criteria. One thing I wanted to bring up is that right now, currently, for almost all nanomaterials and includes graphene, our eco assessors say they don't have enough information to assess that, and it's very difficult to test these kind of chemicals. So again, between all that unknown and the conditions of use, we now have to look at, again, that's why you're subject to regulation, especially if you're a nanomaterial, and why you're going to have trouble with the low volume exemption. If you do submit it, it's not a guarantee we'll say no, but if you have any kind of dispersive use, it's probably better to submit a PMN, or like Alex suggested, if you think you're going to have other uses, you probably want to make sure that they're covered too in a PMN. So that's really the overview. The only thing I want to talk about with 8A, talk about the, just what Alex did. And again, great chance to reach out to everybody. So I think, Terrence, we can go to questions now.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Ask John and Alex to join us as well. And we just do this. There we go. Just like the Hollywood Squares, if anybody's old enough to remember that. So first of all, I want to say thank you for, giving this overview. It's really important kind of to understand the mechanics of it and what the thought flow is. And then I would ask John, if you want to help me do the moderation. Do you want to take one or two of the questions we have? And for the audience, this is really a unique opportunity to ask EPA directly if you have questions about this topic on any aspect of it. So please do post your questions in the Q&A if you can.
Okay, Terrence and Alex and Jim, we only have a few questions so far, but I think more are going to come in. One of the early questions that came in was, does TSCA govern import of a chemical, parentheses graphene, that is already integrated into an application, parentheses, for example, coated on a substrate or bound in a polymer?
All right. Yeah, I saw that one already. So we already had an answer ready for that one. Again, if you're importing graphene or anything else, and this is like a replay of the carbon nanotube development commercially, is if you're incorporated into a polymer and you meet the definition of an article under TSCA, then yes, you don't have to report the import of that chemical because you're importing the article. And it's a harder question when you talk about is it coating on a substrate, because if you're coating onto something, maybe it meets the definition of article, maybe it doesn't. And that's something you can always ask us in a pre-notice question. But generally, yes, if it's incorporating the article. And the carbon nanotube example was people wondered for years is how are we getting these tennis rackets with carbon nanotubes in them? And it turns out they were importing the tennis rackets. They weren't importing the carbon nanotubes. So that part is easy if it's in something like an article. But sometimes if you're talking about a coating, it might be more difficult to figure that out. But again, contact us if you have questions about that.
Thanks, Jim. And I think it's important to make the distinction, and correct me if I'm wrong. If it's in a master batch, but in a liquid form, for example, that would not be considered an article. It has to be a solid. It's not a liquid or a gas, or obviously not a gas, but not in a liquid form. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it has to be something that is ready to use, right? Not to have further processing done to it. Like a tennis racket, you're not processing that further, you're just selling it.
Yeah, one of the definitions of article is it can't be particles or liquids.
Got it.
It can't be gas, yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned a couple times that somebody submitting has to provide any data or testing results that they have, and I guess, or under their control. One of the things that we're trying to do as the Graphene Council is to review all of the studies that have been done, either in vivo or in vitro studies, health exposure tox studies worldwide, right? And there are thousands of articles. So when you say under somebody's control, you mean some study that they've commissioned or conducted. You don't mean in general literature, I assume.
That's correct.
No, yeah.
Yeah. Although I will say, in general, if there is something that you feel is very pertinent to your particular chemical that was not data that you generated, sometimes this happens. There's a European study on, your exact chemical for some reason. And, you can call EPA's attention to that. That's not a wrong thing to do. Be like, also, here's data in the EPA database, don't forget it. No one's going to be mad at that. But yeah, please don't submit every paper ever published on graphene.
Well, does it help you at all if there is some kind of a consensus document or kind of summation of these reports that are available to bring to your attention, or do you feel you already have that?
I don't think you could go wrong in referencing it, at least.
Yeah, I think the key thing is you don't have to submit every single study, but if you have public references, yeah, you can certainly send those. As Alex says, you probably don't want to send every single article. You want to make sure that whatever you're sending you think is pertinent to what you do. But I think companies' questions is, how many what studies do I have to submit? And again, only the ones in their control. But yeah, any kind of public reference, you can just include in a notice if you think that's going to be helpful for review of that particular chemical.
Right. Thank you. John, do you have a question you want to pose?
I see that there's some questions that are similar to each other, and I don't know if we can lump them all together, but one question I think has already been answered, but let me just air it. A person is asking, can the article exemption or the article definition be pellets ready to be injection molded into a new shape? Question mark.
The answer there is no. That doesn't meet the definition of an article.
You're still doing things to it. You got to stop doing things to it.
Okay, so if it's going to be further processed, even if it's in the form of a solid,
then it is still, subject to our review.
Got it. We do actually have quite a few questions, so we'll try to get to as many of these as possible. There are two questions that are kind of connected. One is, what is the cost somebody should anticipate for going through this process, and the other is the amount of time reasonably. And we know there are promulgated times, but the realistic time of actually getting through this process, because there are going to be extensions. As far as the cost is concerned, John, you might want to speak to that. There are certain filing fees, and then very few people self-medicate. Usually companies will ask an expert to help them navigate this process. So we can't speak to what it costs, if you're hiring a specialty law firm or a consultancy to do that. I will say that because of the cost and because of the need to understand the material, the Graphene Council does offer this service now to help companies to do the filing. So I'll throw that out there. We're not going to discuss prices here because I don't think that's appropriate. But John, do you want to talk a little bit, or Alex or Jim, about the filing fees that companies should expect?
Well, I think we should point out that there is, I believe, a proposed rule, Alex and Jim, for increasing the filing fees. I don't know that that's been finalized, but it's going to be quite a bit more than the current fees. I think the current fee for a PMN is something like $19,000, and it might go up to $45,000, for example. Is that true?
That's correct. There's a proposal to increase the fees, and it's an increase across the board. And, as Terrence points out, it's not just the cost of the fees, it's anything else you have when you're trying to either fill out or hire somebody to fill it out. But yes, the cost of the PMN fees, we're proposing to go up. So I would assume that that's going to go, we may adjust that number, we may not, but they are going to go up.
And it is less if you qualify as a small business, which we have a definition for. So, if you're a little startup doing your best, we're not going to, try to punish you and put you out of business at the front end. We'll do that at the back end. But yes, it will be a little bit less. And this is also where it becomes important to have those pre-notice consults of, if you're going to be making a lot of graphenes and they're all kind of similar, do you need multiple individual submissions, or can you have a consolidated submission that encompasses many chemicals? And, that's not always appropriate, but sometimes it is. And when it is, that can be very helpful. So I think that's just something to keep in mind as you go forth, why it's important to have communication with EPA.
John, I think we have a couple of questions about SNRs. I think that might be a topic you want to ask about.
Yeah, there's several questions on SNRs here. It's hard to put them all together, but let me ask a few of them. One specific question is, and I don't know if you can answer this, when is the SNR for Nano Explorer expected to be published?
Sounds like they're asking about a specific chemical. So being a good person from EPA, I need to know more about that particular chemical. So they can contact me if they have a question about that one.
Thank you.
There was a SNR that was published recently, though.
Yeah, and Terrence, there is a question specifically about, I think, that one. There is an existing SNR at 40 CFR 721.10844 for graphene, but the underlying PMN P14763 has not been commenced. Would one need to submit both a PMN and a significant new use notice for a significant new use of that PMN substance?
Oh, great question. And the answer is no, you need to submit a PMN for that because it hasn't been commenced. If it's not on the inventory, TSCA inventory, you need to submit the PMN. And at the same time, you would give us, if there's some new uses, you would identify those as well. So it's only one notice, but it has to be a PMN.
There's a related question. It's one of the most recent. It says, just to be very clear, the PMN filing is per application, then per material. So as an example, one graphene being applied in a composite gel coat versus the same graphene being applied in thermoplastics would be two submissions or one submission. I think I know the answer to this one. And we can tie this into the difference between an LVE and a PMN and naming the applications for your material. But who wants to take that one?
Terrence, you seem confident. I want to see you do it. You got this.
Well, my layman's assumption here is that it's one filing, and you list in your filing all the applications foreseeable for your material. And with the low volume exemption, the double-edged sword there is that you're quite limited to exactly what you get approval for, whereas in a PMN you might have a little more leeway, but you want to name all the potential applications when you do your filing, and the filing is by material, not by application. Did I get it right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Awesome.
See?
John?
Yes. And you can have multiple uses for an exemption. So, but again,
Yes, you can, but then you're tied to whatever of those uses you said. So that's the only key with a PMN. You can say, I want to do 10 things, and then based on the regulation, you might be able to end up doing 11 or 12. With your LVE, whatever you have said, whatever your exemption, notice said, that's what you're doing, and you're not allowed to vary, or we will know, and we will be angry with you.
and it would probably be a good time to add for everybody, just so they know. Again, I'm basing a lot of this on our carbon nanotube experience. One of the requirements we usually have in nanomaterial orders is we hold you to all those potential uses you told us about in your PMN. So we try and include every use we think, fits in terms of we're preventing the risks, but there might be other uses that we want to see. And I can say for carbon nanotubes, those consent orders were ones that we got the most modifications and modification requests for, just because what Alex was bringing up, that this is a new industry, it's a new application, so you're going to find new uses. But just know that when we do a consent order for a graphene material, it's probably going to limit it to a certain number of uses. We try to expand it so that, for instance, if you've got a coating use, we allow as many coating uses as possible. But if there are other uses with much different exposures, then we're probably going to limit that until we get, either a request to modify the order or a significant new use notice, for somebody who's got the new use. So just keep that in mind going forward.
That's helpful. John, do you have another question you want to pose?
There's some questions here that are similar again, and let me see if I can find one that kind of.
And can I make a quick comment as well?
Mm-hmm.
If anything that Jim or I have shared alarms you, and you realize that maybe you are doing something not great, and that maybe you either should have talked to EPA sooner, or you're doing something that we just said you can't do, it is way better for you to come talk to us first now that you realize the error, than wait for us to discover it later. So self-reporting is the way to go. If something is awry, if you have raised a red flag in yourself, you're not being malicious, you just didn't know something was wrong, just self-report, come talk to us. We're not scary. We will help you resolve it. It will be okay.
Thank you.
One question is, are prior TSCA submissions and the resulting outcomes available for review? The thought here that if a new submission matches one already reviewed with findings made, it'd be good to simply take the same findings as the outcome rather than cover the same ground. And I think there was a similar question asking if there was like a repository of determinations that have been made that people can look at to sort of get a feel for that information.
Okay, I'll say a couple of things about that. Number one is we do make our assessments available. When we issued these SNRs, we talked about PMN, consent order, following up with a SNR. When we issue the SNR, the public docket actually has the assessments that we did for that chemical. Now, given the confidential business information that companies usually claim, and especially in something like, this new type business, a lot of those reports are not very useful to people outside EPA, because so much of it is, it's claimed confidential. So it's really difficult for people to follow sometimes some of what goes on in there. Sometimes you do get the general idea about where EPA's concerns are, but you're going to miss a lot of the details about exactly how we got to the determination. But those documents are available, like in our SNR dockets. We've talked about the one recent graphene case, and I think we're about ready to issue another SNR that's going to have a graphene case. If you go to the SNR docket, you can see the assessments we did in there. And then the other thing that I'll say is, over time, again, because these are new chemicals, and from the time we started looking at them until even just 5 years later, a lot of the assessments change. So if you're looking at an early assessment and a later assessment, you'll go, how can they be that different? And a lot of that has to do with getting more information. So if you are comparing assessments like that, just be prepared that, a later assessment may look pretty different from one of the first ones that we did.
Well, along those lines, Jim, we do try to help. I mean, it's one of the things that the Graphene Council does want to do with our graphene classification framework, which is now becoming an ISO standard. And we also have another project within ASTM on doing a classification of different types and forms of graphene so that we can kind of group them. And of course, we're happy to share that with you guys if that helps build this body of knowledge. One of the questions is about end of life. And I have the question as well, when companies are talking about, this is where we intend our product to go. We think it's going to go into epoxy systems for composites, or it's going to go into thermoplastics, or it's going to go into batteries, whatever the case might be. Graphene companies can't always be sure what their customer's going to do with it. It might be an intermediary. How far down that chain does somebody have to think about when they're making their submission about it? Control is not the right word, but influencing how the material is used downstream, constraints on customers for use and PPE and handling and all this sort of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you look at all the way through to end of life?
Sure. I had a long, and this is even before nanomaterials, a long history of that particular issue. In other words, when I'm submitting my PMN, what do I need to tell EPA? And I always bring up the idea that we understand that you don't know a lot of the details of what your customers do. So in those cases, you just submit the information, again, back to that reasonably ascertainable standard. What do you know about it? You tell us. And we say, now, it's never good that we have to fill in the blanks based on what we know about other people who do this, but it's not a requirement that a company does that. So it's in your interest to know as much as you can. And I've seen experience on both sides. I've seen companies that submit PMNs that claim to pretty much know absolutely nothing about what their customers do. And then I've seen companies that can tell you exactly what their customers do. So you get the whole range. And again, the only requirement is to submit what you know. And if you can find out more, it would probably be helpful for you just to give us a better idea of what you expect your customers to do. And then when the regulation gets in place, you'll see that when we're trying to have those same requirements for customers or customers, that'll present some challenges in terms of how soon you can get it to market. But just to kind of go to your question, yeah. The more information you have is the better. But again, there gets to be a point of diminishing returns about how much effort you're going to do to get that information. And a lot of times your customers won't give it to you. So you'll have to make that decision.
Fair enough.
And then, wait, Jim, did we talk about, and then how do you communicate down the safety information or the use or restriction information and what SNRs do for you in that regard?
Okay, yeah, I'll add on to that. So consent orders will have restrictions about how far you can distribute a chemical until the SNR is in place with the same requirements. Once the SNR is in place, then you can distribute to customers who can freely distribute to their customers. In the interim, there's going to be some restrictions in the order of how far they can and in what form they can distribute the chemical. And that'll change case by case. So that's just something else to know, that it's not just I'm submitting my PMN reviews over, now I can go into commercialization. Since you're expecting to get a consent order and it's going to limit the distribution of the chemical, and this is where we get into a little TSCA speak, consent orders or orders only apply to the PMN submitter. They don't apply to the customers. So that's why you're usually, before you can really get fully commercialize the chemical, you're probably waiting until they can until the SNR is in place and everybody's subject to the same restrictions. Now that may change, as Alex was explaining. Sometimes there's limited distribution, so it'll work just that way. But just know that for each order that a company has to sign, they're going to have to deal with that. How far am I going to be able to commercialize this before the SNR is issued?
So while we're on that topic, let's go back to the question about the timeline. So let's say we have a submission for a PMN. Let's say it's as straightforward as is possible under the circumstances. What should a company expect in terms of from time of submission to getting an adjudication on it? And then let's assume there's a consent order that is going to be issued with it. And then there's a period of time until the SNR takes effect. So time of submission, till a decision's made, consent order issued, SNR published, roughly. I know you can't commit, but.
Oh, no, that's okay. It's one of our favorite topics of discussion these days because anybody who's been submitting PMNs lately knows that, yeah, that 90-day is a complete, that's not happening. And we've got, we've had resource issues now for quite a while and they're not going away. So anybody who asks that question, I say probably a minimum, you're looking at roughly a year to get your, to finish the PMN review process with an order. The graphene ones are pretty straightforward unless you have some wildly dispersive use. We either get to an agreement or we don't. So, expect at least a year, and then probably another 6 months after that to get this to have the SNR issued.
Okay. And what can we do from our side as submitters to, accelerate this process or make it or avoid delays? I guess is another way of doing it. What's the best that we can do to navigate this?
Have very complete submissions. Put in all the information you think that we're going to need. And, this is one of those lead the horse to water thing, right? Like just whatever you can do and emotionally and financially prepare for it to take a little bit.
Right. John, do you want to tackle another question from
there's some questions, there's some questions that are kind of related to each other regarding the size of either the particle or the material that they're submitting. For example, one person asks, is there any size discrimination or requirement on size of they're using graphene oxide here, to fall under a specific category? That person means for larger sheets of a few tens of micrometer, is there still any nanomaterials restriction in place? And then let me give you a couple more questions. They're sort of in context. Another question is a PMN required for graphene that would not be considered nano due to agglomeration? And then there was another question here that's a little similar to about carbonaceous materials. And as I assume the questioner is meaning non-graphene carbonaceous materials that have less than 100 nanometers in one dimension. Would that still be required a nano material for the review?
All right, well, this is where we get to talk about TSCA. And just a reminder to everybody, it's a chemical statute. It's not a nanomaterial statute. So the overriding principle is the particle size has nothing to do with whether you need to submit a PMN or not. And carbon nanotubes and graphene have similar characteristics, and they're very difficult to describe, what's a different chemical. And so for most graphene materials, what we're saying is that you'll probably need a PMN because when you intentionally make a material with, say, so many, now I can't remember the things they change, but with so many layers, for instance, in other words, people say graphene and a lot of people just assume one layer or a certain number of layers. Well, we know that's not true. It's got multiple layers. So when you intentionally make something with different number of layers or other characteristics, that's when EPA says it's a new chemical, but it has nothing to do with the actual particle size or a lot of the physical characteristics it exhibits. It has more to do with, and the TSCA term is molecular identity. So that's what, and again, that's why it's good to have a pre-notice meeting with us when you've got a question like this, because you're going to try and figure out, do I need to submit a notice? And we can probably get to the answer pretty quickly once you give us some details about your particular chemical. Anything to add, Alex?
No, that was great. I mean, yeah. If it's a new chemical, you still have to submit it, whether or not it's nanomaterial. Yeah. This is all still applicable to all of the new chemicals, regardless of how big they are.
Understood. We're coming up to the top of the hour, but are you guys okay to stay for just a couple more minutes? Because we have a couple of questions and I don't want to cut it short, but let us know. Do you have a few minutes?
I have a couple of minutes.
I have like 5 minutes. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I'll keep it very brief then. There was a question asking, can you do a joint application? I'll go ahead and answer that because I know we've asked this before, is that companies can come together for a joint filing if their materials are similar enough. And please contact us at the Graphene Council if you want to do that, and we can help connect a couple of companies to do that. Since you all just have a few minutes, then I'll do this so that we can wrap. And I want to give you an opportunity to say some closing words. From my side, especially hearing about the potential price increase and the time that it takes to get an adjudication on this so that you can actually get to commercialization, the time to act is now, is what I'm hearing, right? And the other thing is, because it does take time to prepare the dossier appropriately, because you want it as prepared as possible, you have to allow for that time as well before you even get the starting gun with a submission. So from the Graphene Council, very selfishly, I'll say, please reach out to us, engage with us. We can help you with this process. Even if you want to use somebody else to help you with the actual submission, you can still ask us about information or resources we might have that might be useful to you. And I'm going to ask John if he has any closing comments, and then I'm going to ask our expert speakers, Jim and Alex, if you guys would like to give us the final words. But John, do you have any comments?
No, I think this was a great presentation, Alex and Jim. One last question I saw that might be helpful to answer is, how long does it take to get a pre-notice meeting conversation set up? That's
very fast.
Yes.
Yeah, that's instant. You send that email, we get that email, we'll set it up. That's going to be mostly in my branch for the most part. Is talking to you about your chemistry, and we're available and happy to talk to you about that. So that is not difficult. Normally we talk to you the same week. Normally, awesome. Unless something is weird, but normally it's the same week.
Excellent. So Alex, let's stick with you. If you have any last comments you want to share with anything that maybe we haven't touched that you think we should know about, or just closing comment?
I mean, the PMM process is long and fraught, but we have a lot of resources at the EPA to share with you, to give you information, to guide you, to answer questions. The more you can, be open with us and come to us and ask questions. We are genuinely here to help. We do want, we do want innovation in America. We want to see new materials. So, please do not be afraid to contact us instead of just trying to go it alone. It's a team sport. Please reach out to humans.
Thank you. Jim?
Yeah, I'll add the same thing. And I think Alex is right, especially the pre-notice questions. We answer those pretty quickly, although sometimes it can take a while to get a bigger meeting together with bigger questions and bigger issues. But for the most part, we can answer a lot of the questions like we did today very quickly, and we can get to whatever the next stage is. Oh, do we need to have a big discussion about this, or do we just need to do the back and forth about the chemical nomenclature, for example? Because although that's kind of straightforward, it takes some time. They've got to send us information. We have to look at it. But I think Alex's point is right. We get to the point, or the questions and answers right away, and that's
we will definitely contact you quickly. You may not have your final answers quickly, but we are around and we will contact you back quickly.
Yeah. Well, accessibility is really important, and this closing point that we're actually hitting on is innovation and competitiveness. Graphene is a global phenomenon. It's not restricted to production or use in the United States. There's a global competition to build an entire new industry that's enabled by advanced materials. And so from a United States government strategic perspective, it is really important that we get these materials approved for commercial use, because other people are not waiting, or they're further ahead in the regulatory process, frankly, if we look to REACH in the EU in how they've made progress on this front, or Australia, for example. So we appreciate working with you. I hope you get the sense we're here to do things right, and we're here to do things thoroughly and to do things correctly. On behalf of the Graphene Council, thank you so much for spending your time and your expertise with us. And for everybody who was able to watch and participate in the webinar, thank you for being here. I hope we answered questions for you, or at least made this a little bit more understandable. And we're here to as well to help. So on behalf of us, to everyone who participated, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.